Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take your source material, your reading, your research, your notes, and turn it into structured, digestible, and frankly, fascinating insights.
We're here to cut through the noise.
Exactly. So you can be instantly well-informed on the flashpoints that, really define our cultural landscape.
And today we are wading into some deep, and I mean deep, turbulent water. We're looking at modern fantasy literature.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, that friction point between these massive authorial platforms and contemporary cultural politics.
And the source material for this is, well, it's intense. It's a highly critical commentary delivered to us as a YouTube transcript, and it focuses on one of the biggest names in the genre today, Brandon Sanderson.
You can't get much bigger.
Right. If you've even walked past the fantasy section of a bookstore in the last, decade, you know that name.
For sure.
But this deep dive is anything but a fan appreciation session. This source is deeply critical. It's centered on that really fraught intersection of cultural politics and fantasy fiction.
And it gets specific. It's addressing LGBTQ plus representation in his recent works, particularly in that sprawling epic, The Stormlight Archive.
And the most recent one, Wind and Truth.
Exactly. The one that just came out and finished that arc.
So our mission today is pretty precise, and I think it requires some real care.
Extreme care, yeah. We are tasked with analyzing the specific and often, highly charged criticisms leveled against this major author. We're not taking sides here.
Absolutely not.
We need to detail his public statements, try to understand the authorial intent versus the critical reception presented by our source, and then we have to thoroughly examine the counter-narrative.
The counter-narrative from the source creator themselves.
Right. Who offers this alternative, independent vision for what fantasy publishing should be. It's our job to decode these specific cultural flashpoints raised in the commentary without, endorsing any political side.
And the source material really lays out its case very clearly. It's a transcript, as we said, and it criticizes Sanderson's recent output, mentioning Wind and Truth in particular for what the creator calls pushing a radical LGBTQ agenda.
And it also gets into Sanderson's newly announced special project, The Fires of December.
Right.
And it sets this whole debate against the backdrop of the source creator's own philosophy about independent publishing and what they call cultural preservation.
It's a huge, complex argument. It touches on everything from religion to market share to, the very structure of fantasy.
It really does.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
So let's start by establishing the sheer scale of the subject here. I mean, when we talk about Brandon Sanderson, we're not just talking about a popular author.
No, not at all. We are talking about a true giant of modern literature. He's operating on a level that very, very few authors ever. The sources confirm his platform is immense.
Immense is maybe an understatement.
It is an understatement. He is consistently listed among the world's biggest authors, ranking in the top 50 bestsellers globally. And we need to be clear about what that means.
Okay.
This isn't just best-selling fantasy. This is competing with everything. Every other type of literature, memoir, cookbook, you name it.
Right. He's up there with the Grishams and the Stephen Kings of the world.
Exactly. That level of sustained commercial success year after year, it's a huge indicator of his reach and his influence in the cultural conversation.
And that kind of market penetration, it translates directly into real-world power and infrastructure that, most authors can only dream of.
That's the key point. The source notes that his name cache, his brand, is so immense that he hosts his own annual convention in Utah. It's called the Dragonsteel Nexus.
Just stop and think about that for a second.
I mean, really?
How many authors, even ones who've been around for 50 years, have the gravity to command that kind of dedicated yearly pilgrimage from their fan base?
Almost none. Where attendees fly in, they gather for announcements, for readings, for community. This isn't just an author anymore. This is a fully established, self-sustaining literary institution.
Right. And it's precisely that huge platform, that institutional status, that makes the high-level structural critiques leveled against him so interesting. The source actually starts there, questioning the whole viability of his overarching fictional universe, the Cosmere.
Yes, and this is a fascinating place to begin. The initial structural critique is aimed squarely at what the source labels the multiverse fatigue.
Multiverse fatigue. I think we all know what that feels like.
We do. The source expresses this absolutely. Marvel, DC, and even Star Trek.
The big three.
The source argues these mega franchises have killed it as far as everybody is concerned out there. Now, the insight here, and this is key for you, the listener, is that the critique isn't necessarily about the quality of the Cosmere's execution.
It's about saturation.
It's a criticism of cultural saturation. What was once, a unique, ambitious, structural approach now for this critic feels like a tired franchise. The novelty has just been diluted by the broader pop culture.
So it's a structural argument based on external market forces, which is a really interesting way to open a critique of a fantasy series. Does the source at least acknowledge how hard it is to create something like the Cosmere in the first place?
They do, and this is where it shows some necessary nuance, which is good. The source is careful to provide context and praise for what they call the Cosmere's original ambition. They acknowledge that when Sanderson first started developing and executing this concept, the idea of several distinct fantasy worlds all linked by these subtle mechanics and shared history, it was truly considered ambitious.
And unique.
And unique, yeah, compared to other works being published at the time. This distinction is vital. They're critiquing the current relevance of the concept, not the historical originality of the author.
So they're saying, good idea then, maybe not so much now.
That's the gist of it. A great idea that's been sort of co-opted and overused by bigger players.
And what exactly is the glue that holds this massive, sprawling universe together, narratively speaking? The sources seem to put a lot of emphasis on one character, Hoyd.
Hoyd is the critical structural element. He is the ultimate connective tissue. The source explains his role as this enigmatic traveler, the one character who links all these disparate fantasy universes.
So he pops up in all the different series.
He does, across various planets. From the war-torn Roshar in Stormlight to the ash-choked Scadrial in Mistborn, Hoyd appears, but he's often disguised.
Right, so he's not always obvious.
Not at all. Sometimes he's a cryptic mentor, sometimes a beggar, or a seemingly insignificant story. The mystery surrounding his identity, his powers, his true mission, that is perhaps the deepest long-term structural mechanism of the entire cosmos.
So Hoyd isn't just a fun cameo or an Easter egg. He's the central mystery that's being slowly revealed.
Absolutely. The source notes that Hoyd is a central mystery being revealed over decades and dozens of books.
Wow.
This commitment to a slow burn, long-term payoff is exactly what made the Cosmere unique in the first, but it also creates the very complexity that the critics suggest now leads to fatigue. It requires immense devotion.
And in a world where, media is consumed so quickly, a 30-book-long mystery might be a tough sell for new readers.
That's the argument the sources make, that this slow, deliberate structure is suffering under the weight of multiverse overexposure from other...
Okay, so the stage is set. We have an author with a gigantic platform, an ambitious but perhaps saturated concept, and now it seems like the source is about to shift the critique entirely.
Yep. Away from structural complexity
and
straight into the explosive subject of content and author intent.
And this is where the commentary gets particularly sharp. The absolute core of the source's argument is that Sanderson's actions and his creative decisions fundamentally contradict his personal background, which leads them to the suspicion of, external coercion.
This is the absolute foundation of the source's ideological objection. They focus intensely on his religion, highlighting what they call the Mormon contradiction.
Okay.
The source points out that Sanderson is a prominent member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormon, and argues that his faith contradicts pushing the LGBTQ lifestyle in every aspect.
That's a direct quote.
That's a direct quote. This perceived discrepancy between his personal beliefs and his published fiction is the critical flashpoint that the source uses to question his integrity and his authorial.
We need to pause here, though, and provide some necessary context for the listener. Because to frame the source's critique accurately, we have to recognize that the source is using a very specific, very conservative interpretation of that faith.
Precisely. That's a crucial point. The complexity of faith and modern cultural issues is immense.
Of course.
And while the official LDS Church has historically held conservative positions on marriage and gender, there is a wide spectrum of belief within the LDS.
Right, so there are many members who wouldn't see a contradiction.
Many liberal or progressive Mormon voices see no contradiction at all in supporting LGBTQ rights while maintaining their faith. But the source uses the starkest possible contrast to frame the author's decision as a binary.
Either he follows this perceived strict religious mandate, or he compromises his faith. There's no middle ground in their view.
None whatsoever. And that framing serves to highlight what they see as a cultural betrayal.
So if the author is perceived to be acting against his faith, the source has to come up with a reason why he's making these creative decisions.
Exactly.
And this leads directly to their speculation about external pressure and, cynical career.
The suggestion put forward by the source is severe. They speculate that Sanderson either got so much heat for a prior, more conservative stance, or that
Taking the ticket. I saw that phrase.
Taking the ticket, yeah. Aligning himself with the broader literary establishment became more important to him than his religious conviction.
So the implication is that this dramatic shift from an author known for being faith-based to one who is an unequivocal champion of LGBTQ inclusion wasn't a genuine change of heart.
Correct. The source frames it as either being externally coerced or politically motivated to satisfy the publishing world rather than arising from any real personal evolution of.
That is a hefty claim that a globally successful author would compromise his core values just for career advancement. But the source points to a specific piece of evidence to justify this.
They do. They point to Sanderson's own public statements on the matter.
So they use his own words again.
Absolutely. And we have to analyze this explicit public statement as it's quoted direct. This quote was from a post Sanderson made about the win, where he lays out his.
And what did he say?
He said, "My current stance is one of unequivocal support for LGBT."
Unequivocal support. That's very strong. There's no ambiguity there. And the source details the specific political positions he affirms, right?
Yes, and the detail here is crucial because it leaves no room for interpretation. He states he supports gay marriage, trans rights, the rights of non-binary people, and the right of trans people to affirm their identity with love.
It's a comprehensive.
It is. And furthermore, he explicitly states he is anti-discrimination, which means he opposes laws that would restrict the rights group. This is a complete position-by-position declaration.
What's fascinating is how the source immediately uses his declared timeline of political action again. They sort of turn a statement of consistency into a cause for suspicion.
Precisely. It's a very clever rhetorical. Sanderson claimed he has voted consistently along these progressive lines for the last.
Okay.
The source immediately connects this 15-year time frame, which aligns with the period when he got kind of bigger, to the argument that this is when he made the change.
So they're fueling that taking the ticket theory.
Exactly. The claim is that his public political stance evolved precisely when he was achieving massive commercial success and entering the mainstream literary establishment. It suggests opportunism rather than genuine conviction.
And they tie that timing to a very specific and rather dramatic claim that personifies this alleged external pressure. This is the handler theory.
This is where the dialogue structure becomes critical, and we have to report this claim neutrally, but also recognize its rhetoric.
Understood.
The source alleges that the author's stance changed after he started associating closely with a fellow author, Mary Robinette Kowal, who is a successful science fiction and fantasy writer in her own right.
Okay, so they were collaborators.
They co-hosted the Writing Excuses podcast together, and the source suggests she was sent in kind of as his handler.
Sent in? Wow. That's a severe accusation to make about a professional collaborator. How does the source even begin to justify leveling a claim that bold?
The justification lies in the source's perception of the podcast's shift in tone. The source asserts that Cowell's inclusion changed the dynamic of Writing Excuses dramatically.
From what to what?
They say it transformed from a show focusing purely on the mechanics of writing craft and creativity to one that focused heavily on feminism and all these other political things.
So the critic views this change as evidence of external political influence.
Exact. An attempt to steer Sanderson's public persona and his private beliefs to align with what they see as established progressive cultural expectation. By labeling her a handler, the source effectively delegitimizes any possibility that Sanderson's beliefs evolved on their own.
And we should note, this alleged new establishment-friendly stance is in sharp contrast with what the source claims was his prior stance on inclusion.
A very sharp contrast. The source claims that earlier in his career, Sanderson had explicitly said he was not going to write gay characters.
And he gave a reason for that.
Yes, explicitly linking that decision to his traditional Mormon beliefs at the time. This contrast is absolutely central to the source's entire argument.
So the shift from consciously excluding these characters based on faith to actively supporting and including them
is viewed not as artistic growth, but as a complete capitulation to political and commercial pressure.
Okay, so let's pivot to how Sanderson himself tries to bridge that gap. He connects his intent to his creative output. He provided a quote on inclusion to explain his reasoning.
He did. He stated that he puts LGBTQ people into his books and will continue to do so. And he provides a key defense choice. He said, it's not because I want to fulfill a quota, but because I genuinely believe that it's the right characters and it's good and important.
So that's a defense of organic, necessary inclusion. He's saying it's driven by artistic and moral conviction, not token.
He's positioning the decision as authentic to the narrative and the world.
But the source immediately provides a strong rebuttal to that claim of genuine belief,
Wow.
right? They dismiss the artistic argument entirely.
They do. The source reframes his decision through a purely religious lens, arguing that by including these characters and lifestyles, he is pushing sinful behaviors that his religion specifically states against.
So therefore,
the source asserts the choice is inherently political and contradicts his faith's teachings on morality. They claim it doesn't make any sense for him to be doing this unless the motivation is entirely external pressure from him.
so the conversation immediately shifts from literary critique to really a moral indictment.
Instantly.
And finally, the source connects this whole ideological argument to the transactional, to the financial realm. They highlight the financial connection he made to back up his public statement.
Right. To demonstrate his commitment was more than just words, Sanderson announced a sizable donation to Top Pride Center and the Out Fund using proceeds from...
And this financial connection is met with immediate, sharp criticism from the source.
Yes, and it's critical for our listeners to understand that the source immediately escalates the language dramatically here. They label these specific groups as grooming organizations.
We have to emphasize the specific phrase is highly inflammatory.
It is.
And it's used by the source creator to delegitimize the author's financial support. It escalates the debate from a political disagreement to a severe moral condemnation.
Absolutely. The use of such politically polarized and morally loaded language serves a very distinct rhetorical function. It warns the reader that when you purchase Sanderson's works, you are not just buying a book. You are potentially sending your money directly to organizations that the source views as actively detrimental culture.
So it moves the argument into a direct moral and financial opposition.
It makes the very act of consumption a political statement in itself. The message from this critic, the money, the faith, the political statement, and the fiction are all inseparable and, in their view, fundamental.
Okay, so if the last section was all about external intent and politics, this section drills down into the supposed failures inside the book, the execution failures and ideological concerns within the actual pages of the novel, specifically Wind and Truth.
Right.
And it seems the source is trying to critique the execution, not just the politics. We need to focus on whether they can successfully separate that artistic quality from their thematic disagreement.
And that separation is the source first confirms the factual aspect of the specific character inclusion. Wind and Truth did prominently feature both a gay character and a transgender character.
So they acknowledge the representation is physically present.
Yes, the conflict isn't over if it's there, but how it's there.
And the core of the complaint is the critique of execution, where the source claims these inclusions were poorly handled from a technical writing perspective. These are specific technical criticisms, so let's break them down.
Okay, the first claim is one of disproportionate press. The content was described as awful and very heavily featured.
Implying it just took up too much narrative space.
Exactly, that it detracted from the core plot or the established tone of the series. The second and more technical critique is that the dialogue used was very anachronistic.
Anachronistic, so out of time, out of place.
Right, or as they put it, very modern dialogue. The suggestion is that the specific language and cultural assumptions used by these characters jarred severely with the established, pseudo-medieval or early industrial setting of this fantasy world.
Anachronistic dialogue in a secondary world fantasy setting is a serious technical charge for a world builder like Sanderson. What would that even look like in practice?
Well, in a setting like the Stormlight archive, where you have these complex social hierarchies, different cultures, magic-based technology, if characters suddenly start speaking with, say, 21st century internet slang or using highly specific modern political phrasing, it just breaks the immersion.
So they might say something like, that's so cringe in a high fantasy setting.
Something like that, yeah. Or using very specific 21st century social justice terminology that just feels completely out of place for that character in that world. The critic is arguing that the author failed to translate modern identity and political concepts into language and cultural context that felt appropriate for that specific fantasy setting.
Which would suggest the author was prioritizing the clarity of the political message over the consistency of the world building.
That's precisely the charge being leveled.
And what was the third major technical claim?
The source claims the scenes were very much shoehorned in.
Ah, the classic shoehorned critique.
Right, implying they were inserted awkwardly and lacked any organic integration, plot, or the character. The ultimate conclusion drawn from all these technical failures is that the representation was poorly done and did not fit the characters or the setting whatsoever.
So the source concludes the content was all about politics and not a natural and necessary part of the narrative.
Correct. So we see the synthesized insight here. The source is using technical language critiquing, pacing, dialogue integration as the vehicle for a purely thematic and ideological objection.
They're arguing that the political purpose of the content was so dominant that it completely destroyed the artistic quality of the delivery.
Yes, and this, of course, feeds directly into the broader woke craze argument that the source is making about cultural warfare in general.
Right.
The source frames this content not just as an artistic choice by one author, but as part of a larger systemic effort to change the culture, fueled by what they see as an arbitrary overrepresentation of certain demographics.
This leads them to their direct numerical argument.
The famous less than 1% statistic.
I've seen this one.
The source puts forth a numerical argument that if LGBTQ plus people are less than 1% of the population, then why are they like 50% of the characters out?
Okay, 50% is obviously an exaggeration for effect.
It is, but the point they're making is about a profound overrepresentation that they claim lacks realism relative to global population demographics. This argument implies that fiction should strive for some kind of statistical demographic act.
Which is in itself a tool in a broader ideological debate about what fiction.
Absolutely. And this numerical argument immediately connects to the culture framing because they're not just arguing for statistical realism in fantasy novels.
No, the stakes are much higher for them.
Correct. The source explicitly believes that this pervasive content is part of an effort to pervert the cult. They argue explicitly that Christians need to push back again, framing their own platform and independent publishing efforts as a battle to preserve the culture against what they view as corrupting influences pervading.
So the stakes are presented as existential for cultural tradition.
Totally. This is why the source views their fight as this huge uphill battle against the combined forces of mainstream publishing and Hollywood.
And to underline this culture war point, this whole narrative of marginalization versus establishment reward, the source uses a seemingly tangential example to show who they believe the establishment is giving access to.
Right. They contrast Sanderson's massive platform with another figure in the online fantasy community, a YouTuber named Daniel Green.
And what's the claim about him?
The source claims he is pushing like sex toy products now in his videos directly, and they highlight the perceived irony here.
Irony.
That this type of content is allowed and even promoted by platforms like YouTube. They claim the videos are not being flagged by YouTube as 18 up, while their own voice and what they call traditional fantasy content is allegedly suppressed or blacklisted by conventions and mainstream publishers.
So this anecdote's function is purely rhetoric. It's meant to solidify the source's narrative that the perverted culture, which they define as anything non-traditional, from political inclusion to explicit product placement, is actively being rewarded and granted access by the gatekeepers.
While voices of traditional dissent are systematically excluded, it creates a very clear moral landscape for the listener. On one side, you have the establishment promoting what they see as degeneracy, and on the other, you have the source author fighting for cultural preservation and artistic integrity against overwhelming odds.
And that is the entire context under which the critique of Sanderson's choices must be understood. Okay, so the conversation now moves from past critique and current politics to future speculation. It focuses on a major new announcement made at that Dragon Steel Nexus event.
Right.
This is the new novel titled The Fires of December.
Yes, the title and the details were a key announcement at the convention, and it immediately raised questions about content and publishing strategy. And what's fascinating here is the language used to describe the project.
Which leads to what the outline calls the secret project paradox.
Exactly.
Why are they calling it a secret project if he just announced it publicly on a stage?
Well, the source correctly questions why it's still being branded as special project or secret project. Sanderson not only announced the title and showed the cover art, but he actually read 2 chapters to the convention audience.
So it's not a secret at all.
Not in any real sense. It's a paradox of branding. It's an effort to maintain the mystique, the sense of an exclusive drop, even after publicly unveiling all the essential detail. It's leveraging the success of his prior, genuinely secret project, even though this one is now very marked.
Let's talk about the aesthetics, because the source spent some time on the design notes for the cover art.
The description is pretty striking. The source notes interesting, weird designs on the cover and suggests it reminds them strongly of a Japanese novel or perhaps a manga aesthetic.
Really?
Yeah, they specifically express appreciation for the visual elements, like the eyes and these swirling monsters on the cover, saying it's reminiscent of Studio Ghibli works.
Like Princess Mononoke or Totoro.
Exactly. They mention those 2 by name. It's a visually distinct approach that seems to break from the often heavy, epic, Western-style fantasy covers that are associated with the Stormlight archive. The source did note the stylistic oddity since Sanderson isn't Japanese, but they did appreciate the design itself.
So visually distinct, potentially appealing to different readers, But let's get into the significance of its format. What is this book?
The Fires of December is confirmed to be a standalone novel, so that's a break from his main multi-book sagas like Stormlight or Mist.
But it's still on the Cosmere.
It remains set within the overarching Cosmere multiverse, yeah. This is crucial because it keeps it connected narratively to his mainstream work, but its release method links it to his independent efforts.
And to understand the importance of that special project label, we have to understand the Kickstarter context.
That Kickstarter context is absolutely essential. The source reminds us that the whole secret projects idea originated from that highly publicized campaign.
The one that was the most successful Kickstarter of all time.
That's the one. It featured 4 books, and significantly, the source states that they personally read 2 of those original 4 books and noted very approvingly that those specific books did not push the LGBTQ agenda and stuff.
Ah, so that provides the source with a baseline, a hope, maybe.
A hope that this new 5th secret project might similarly exclude the content they object to. It allows them to separate the special projects from the mainstream Stormlight material in their mind.
And this classification as a special project leads to the most important business implication mentioned in the source, the self-publishing shift. Why does the source speculate this? Suggests he's moving away from traditional quarter publishing.
Well, if the Fires of December is truly handled like the previous secret projects, via a dedicated campaign and direct fulfillment, it means a direct-to-consumer model. It largely bypasses traditional corporate publishers like Tor or Macmillan.
So he doesn't need them for this.
The source speculates that this indicates Sanderson is veering away from traditional publishing and effectively self-publishing the book. It means he no longer needs the corporate publisher to actually push his material, and the source recognizes this as a big shift in fantasy.
It shows a path to true authorial independence, even for the biggest names in the business.
Right.
And despite all the political and content disagreements we've just spent the last 20 minutes discussing, the source expresses genuine appreciation for the independence of this move.
This is perhaps the most nuanced and interesting point in the entire source. The critic, who champions independent publishing, highlights that having high-profile figures like Brandon Sanderson branching out and moving away from the corporate structure,
the structure that dominates a lot of the big fantasy,
is a positive trend that they do appreciate and actually want more of in this environment. It shows an ideological agreement on the business structure, the decentralization of power coexisting with a fundamental ideological disagreement on content and politics.
They respect the independence even if they despise the output.
Exactly.
But despite that structural appreciation, the immediate overriding concern for the listener and for the source author remains: will this new book have the same politically charged content?
And the source states they are deeply hesitant
To
even check out any new ones at this point. Their specific stated condition for reading The Fires of December would be an official statement from Sanderson confirming the content excluded.
something direct like, yeah, we're not putting that in this book.
That's what they say they'd need. They conclude that the current signal from Sanderson's previous statements and output is that the political agenda is going to be in everything he puts out.
So the expectation is set for continued inclusion.
Yes. Thus maintaining an ideological barrier to entry for this specific segment of his potential readership.
We focus so heavily on the critique of the mainstream giant, Brandon Sanderson. So now let's shift our focus to the author of the source material himself, because he presents himself and his publishing efforts as the necessary antidote to everything he sees as wrong with the industry.
This section reveals the source author's identity and his own operational model. He establishes his credentials as a prolific independent author who has written more than 25.
So he's establishing his authority not just as a cultural critic, but as a practical, successful practitioner of what he preaches.
He's offering a concrete, functioning alternative to the corporate model he's critiquing.
And he emphasizes a very different independent model for publishing, one that prioritizes rapid, direct engagement with the reader.
His whole promotional strategy centers around a specific newsletter offer to attract new readers away from the corporate giants.
What's the offer?
By signing up, readers get 3 free books: a sci-fi book, a fantasy novella called Night Train, he notes was his first #1 bestseller, and a full superhero graphic novel.
So he's providing a smattering of diverse, fast-paced content.
Exactly. Sci-fi, fantasy, comics. He's trying to demonstrate he has a little of something for everybody who feels disillusioned with the mainstream.
And his writing philosophy also stands in stark contrast to the modern epic fantasy trend that Sanderson champions with these massive 500,000-word tomes. This is a direct critique of the commercial-length norm.
It is. The source author advocates for a quicker, shorter fantasy book. His specific technical claim is that fantasy novels can and should be done at 80,000 words.
Like a classic pulp fantasy length.
Precisely. This size, he argues, works just fine. It prioritizes pace, efficiency, and completion rather than the big, sprawling 300,000-word epics that are now so common.
Which he sees as bloated or unnecessarily drawn out by the corporate structure.
Right. He's promoting a more streamlined narrative, a return to base.
But his platform is defined as much by what he's against, the establishment, as what he's for. He makes specific, very strong claims of ban blacklisting against the traditional genre community.
These claims are absolutely central to his self-portrayal as a marginalized, persecuted voice fighting the establishment. He explicitly states he is blacklisted from all of fantasy and sci-fi publishing.
And he backs that up.
He does. He details that he is banned from the World Science Fiction Convention, which is Worldcon, and expects the same ban for the upcoming World Fantasy Convention. He notes explicitly that it's run by the same organizing.
So this alleged institutional rejection is key to his whole narrative.
It's the basis for his entire argument that he is being penalized for speaking out against the cultural trends he opposes. The message to his audience, the genre establishment is actively trying to silence voices that do not conform to the progressive cultural norms they are trying to pervert the culture.
It confirms that uphill battle mindset he's promoting.
Exactly.
So if he is blacklisted from the mainstream, what is the mission of his counter-platform? How does he define his niche?
His platform's mission is to be the voice of real fantasy news.
Real fantasy news.
News that does not shill for mainstream. It's a mission driven by cultural preservation and ideological purity.
So supporting independent publishing.
And actively fighting to preserve the culture by trying to bring it back to what it was. Presumably a time before the political content he objects to became so prominent. He views his platform as a necessary counter to what he sees as a corrupted mainstream media narrative.
Framing his work as a cultural necessity, not just another publishing venture.
Yes.
And he finishes with a very clear call to action directed at the listener, offering a path for those who share his disillusion.
The encouragement is very straightforward. If you, the listener, like fun action and want something different, and different here means fantasy-free of the content he labels as a political agenda, then you should support independent publishing.
By signing up for his newsletter and checking out his Amazon store?
Right. He is urging them to stop supporting the mainstream corporate structure and to actively fund an alternative, ideologically aligned ego. So, in synthesizing this whole extended discussion, this deep dive really reveals a major, unavoidable fault line running directly through the contemporary fantasy.
Oh.
On one side, you have an established giant like Brandon Sanderson, who is using his immense platform built on this ambitious world building like the Cosmere to explicitly advocate for and incorporate diverse cultural content.
But according to critics like our source, this often comes at the expense of thematic consistency or artistic execution.
Driven by perceived political pressure.
And on the opposing side, you have the voice of the source author, a prolific, independent writer who champions an entirely different publishing and artistic model.
He claims marginalization and blacklisting while promoting a return to traditional cultural values, a focus on fun action and efficiency.
And a more streamlined, independent publishing. The critical takeaway here seems clear. For this critic, the massive commercial success of mainstream fantasy is now deeply linked to a specific set of progressive politics and cultural norms.
Which makes separating the art from the author's politics virtually impossible in their eyes.
It highlights a critical modern tension. Is the inclusion driven by genuine artistic belief and evolving morality, as Sanderson himself states?
Or is it a calculated political move to secure status within the establishment and satisfy corporate gatekeepers, as the source alleges with the handler theory and the timeline critique?
And the fact that the debate immediately leaps to financial donation, which the source labels with those inflammatory terms, and alleged changes in religious conviction, it just shows how high the stakes are in this modern cultural battle over what fantasy fiction should represent.
Yeah.
The material really shows that for a significant subset of readers, the politics and public statements of an author and their perceived alignment with the establishment are now completely inseparable from the fictional worlds they create.
Even for monumental years-in-the-making projects like the Cosmere.
The content of the book is almost secondary to the perceived political allegiance of the author.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought for you to mull over. Considering the source's own observation that even mega authors like Sanderson are increasingly moving away from corporate publishing leveraging systems like Kickstarter to go direct to consumer, is this massive decentralization of power in the industry actually making it easier or harder for different political and social perspectives to coexist?
That's a great question.
Does the collapse of the traditional gatekeepers lead to a greater overall diversity of voices? Or does it simply lead to a further fragmentation of the audience into entirely separate, ideologically separated publishing community that will never, ever read each other's.
Something to think about as you decide which universe and which ecosystem to dive into next. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.